Welcome back to Supply Chain Management. In this lecture, we are going to continue talking about aggregate planning, but now we're going to talk about how we're going to set this up in Excel and solve the problem. So the Excel setup essentially has these following steps. You set up the problem in Excel, you make sure the last month's stockout is set to 0, and of course, because we already have been told in the problem that ending inventory is 500, we need to make sure that the ending inventory is 500. The outputs you're going to have is you're going to calculate your total cost, which is your objective function, and you need to minimize it. We want to calculate our seasonal inventory, which is the average inventory held during the time period. And here we're using this formula to create a weighted average. This is the beginning inventory before the time period starts, ending inventory at time period 6. We take the average of those two, and then we add up the sum of the middle inventories and we divide it by the total number of time periods. So remember that if this is not 6 time periods and if this is 12, then this will be I0, I12, t is equal to 1 to 11, and there will be 12 time periods here. We're going to calculate the average flow time. How much time does a component stay in the inventory on average? And this is seasonal inventory divided by average demand. So let's go switch over to Excel. So the first step when we start working on Excel is to get our inputs all in one place. And the inputs include your forecast, your costs, all of that has to be, go ahead and please copy it down and put it right here. All right. This is a cell which you need to calculate each worker produces, and you're going to say number of working days multiplied by number of hours per day, right? 20 days a month, 8 hours, that's 160 hours a month, and it takes about 4 labor hours per unit. And so you need to calculate that and keep that ready. Once you have this ready, we can start working on our aggregate plan. Let's set up our decision variables. Now remember, our decision variables are going to be, let's go ahead and click that on. You are going to have number of hired, number laid off, number of people working, overtime, inventory, stock out, subcontracting, production, demand, and then here is the price of the product if it's given to you. Now remember, for aggregate planning, since we are focusing on cost, not on revenue, you don't have to worry so much about the price of the product. It's in the next chapter, sales and operations plan, that we will actually focus on the price of the product. The next step is to actually go ahead and put the number of time periods. So time periods here are 0 to 6, right? You will need a 0. So let's go ahead and put the 0 to 6. If you have 12 time periods, if demand is for an entire year, you're going to put 1 to 12 here. All right. And here we have this whole part is going to be set up. Let's go ahead and set this entire part up. So we have all the values set up here. Now your demand here, go ahead and use equal to and select this. So remember that you want to use formulas rather than just put the demand in, because later on, if you change this value here, it automatically changes here. All right. You have a starting workforce of 80, and so we're going to select that here. Our beginning inventory is, we have a beginning inventory of 1,000. There is no beginning stock out. None of this is set up. So here, this is your decision variable, and you know that these two here will have to come here as constraints, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So now we have set up the first part with the decision variables, and now we're going to start working on the constraints. All those equations you had, we're going to start working on them. So now we come to the part of fixing the constraints. And these constraints are four kinds. We have workforce constraints, inventory constraints, production constraints, and overtime constraints. And remember, we talked about this in the previous lecture, where workforce, we have to look at hiring and firing and the previous number of workers, where inventory has to take into account stock out and demand and production and subcontracting. Production capacity is based on how much you can produce, normal time and overtime has to be less than how much there is. So let's use each one and let's talk about each one as we go through this problem. So let's do the first one. And here we have inventory constraints. So let's look at the first one. And in inventory constraints, we're going to start looking and focusing on, and let's go here. We're going to say, we're looking at workforce constraints. And for the first time period, W1, this is equal to 80, which is nothing but W0 plus how many you're hiring minus how much you lay off in time period 1. So if you want to rearrange this whole thing, we could have W1 minus W0 minus H1 plus L1 is equal to 0. So you're basically bringing this whole part here to the right-hand side. Or we can do W0 plus H1 minus L1 minus W1 is equal to 0. In this case, you are essentially bringing W1 to this side, right? So either way, both are correct. Pick one and work with it. And we're going to implement these equations in Excel right now. So we said, let's do this. Your beginning workforce plus how much you're hiring minus how much you laid off minus the number of workers you currently have. Now this value has to be equal to 0. And once you've set this up, you can copy this and you can paste it down here. All these values, when we put the numbers here, have to be equal to 0. So let's go ahead and just put a little note here. This has to be equal to 0. Okay, so we know what we need to do when we go to the analytics solver. The next one is inventory constraints. So let's again look at the inventory constraints. Let's go ahead and write those constraints out. So here we have, if you remember right, we have beginning inventory minus beginning stock out plus subcontracting plus production. That's equal to your demand plus ending inventory minus ending stock out, right? So here's all the amount of things which are coming in to the system, and then here's all the stuff which is going out of the system. So if you want to rearrange this, and this here D1 is 1600, if you're going to rearrange this, you can do I0 minus I1 minus S0 plus S1 plus C1 plus P1 is equal to 1600. Okay, so let's go ahead and set this function up and make sure we get it right. So here we go. We're going to say I0 minus I1 minus S0 plus S1 plus subcontracting C1 plus production, right? This value is going to be equal to demand, right? Or you can go ahead and say you can subtract You can go put minus demand and say equal to 0. But for this class, let's just make it equal to demand. So we are going to go ahead and copy this all the way down, right? And as you copy it, make sure these cells are properly moved down step by step. All right, so now we're going to talk about production. So let's look at production and let's think about what the total amount you're going to produce cannot be more, has to be less than your capacity. So let's look at your capacity. Each worker produces 40 units a month. And here, this cell is going to tell you how many units it is. And therefore, let's go ahead and write it out. Production here, P1, is less than or equal to 40, and that's this 40 here, times W1. And then you're going to work overtime. Here's overtime, and you cannot, it's number of hours. Overtime here is number of hours. So if this is 4 hours per unit, if you work 01 hours, if you divide it by 4, this is going to get you your the number of units you produce. So we can kind of move this value to this side. 40W1 plus O1 by 4 minus P1 is greater than or equal to 0. That's what we're going to look at. Greater than or equal to 0. Okay? So let's clear this. And we're going to say, let's go ahead and put 40. That's this. Now remember, if you're going to use this and you're going to copy this down, you need to press the F4 key to get these dollar signs here. All right? It's very important that you do that. Multiplied by your W1 right here, plus, right? And now you're going to look at O1. And O1 is going to be divided by 4. Again, if you're going to use this, use your function key, F4, minus P1, right? This value has to be, and again, we're going to put, this has to be greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so we're going to copy this down and paste it all over. Use formulas, paste the formulas, right? Just double click a couple more, make sure that you're selecting the right values, that you put the dollar sign, all that is important. Now we get to the last part, which is overtime. And overtime is important because here this is overtime in hours, and each worker can work only about 10 hours at the maximum. So this value here, total number of hours, should be less than or equal to 10 times this value, right? So essentially, if we say, and let me go ahead and put that equation in and write it out and show you how to move the equations. So overtime is less than or equal to 10W1, and therefore 10W1 minus overtime is greater than or equal to 0. We're just moving this here, and we get this equation here. So let's go ahead and set that up. And so we say 10 comes from here. Again, you've got to, anything from the input side, you got to put an F4 multiplied by W1 minus O1. This one will be greater than 0. And again, let's put something here that will remind us that this should be greater than 0. All right. So we've got all these set up. We just need to copy and paste this right down here. And there we've got all the constraints set up. The next step will be to start calculating all the costs, and we'll get to that. But first, remember that we've got to get our constraints done right. Now we get to the part about calculating costs. So for each one of these hiring for um, for the time period, for hiring, for layoff, um, there is specific costs here, right? And so we've got to then copy time periods 1 to 6. We've got to figure out what the costs are. So let's go ahead and set this up. So hiring costs. Hiring cost is going to be essentially $300, and you have to put an F4 multiplied by the number of workers hired in that time period. We can copy this down, but let's wait and do each one first. The second one is layoff costs. Layoff costs is 500. Again, you need to do an F4. Don't forget that F4. And here's the layoff costs. Now, when it comes to regular time, remember that the regular time cost is only $4 per hour. So you've got to start with $4 an hour, right? Now, don't forget that we are looking for an entire month. Each worker makes, we have 20 working days, and we have 8 hours. So they make totally 640, and then you multiply it by the number of workers, right? Overtime is essentially $6 an hour, F4 multiplied by overtime here, right? Anytime you miss the dollar sign, which you have here, it's going to cost you more problems. It'll make the problem wrong, and it'll give you a lot of issues. So be very careful. Inventory holding cost $2 per unit, F4 multiplied by the number of inventory. Stock out here, you're going to get the marginal cost of stock out, F4 multiplied by the stock out cost. Subcontracting, you're going to select the subcontracting cost multiplied by this value here. And then production, you basically taking the material cost, F4 multiplied by the production. It is not a bad idea to check and make sure you have dollar signs on each one. So you can copy this entire thing and then paste function. And as you can see, just make sure you are selecting these correctly. Now, once you do this, you can now calculate the total cost. So here you can kind of look at the total for each one. It's the sum of total hiring costs. This gives you some interesting answers if you want to copy this and paste these values. And you will find that the answers you get here would be interesting, and it'll be good for analysis right now. Okay. So the last part, now we are pretty much almost done. We have to calculate total cost, total revenue. You have to get the seasonal inventory. All those things have to be done. Let's go ahead and copy this. I'm going to go ahead and create these values. Your total cost is nothing but the sum of all this, right? That's your total cost. Your total revenue, if you're given the price, then you can calculate, and we are going to assume that the price is $40. So $40 here, and therefore you can use the sum product function here of saying that the sum product of the demand, comma, price, which will give you the total revenue. Your total profit is revenue minus cost. Your seasonal inventory is essentially you're going to take the beginning inventory plus ending inventory divided by 2, right? So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to say beginning inventory plus ending inventory divided by 2, right? Plus, and then the sum of the middle here And then this whole thing, you've got to put another parentheses, this whole thing divided by, and it's the last time period, 6. There are 6 time periods. And so this is your seasonal inventory, and then your average flow time is your seasonal inventory divided by, and instead of doing the sum, you can just divide it by the average demand here. All right, so this gives you those values. And with this, you are done with setting up the Excel file, and now it's time to go to the analytics solver to set up the solver model so we can run this. So here we are almost to the end, and we're going to optimize this. The objective here is to minimize our total costs. So we are going to minimize our total costs, and then your variables, which you're going to use to minimize this, are from time period 1 are all these variables here. These are the variables which you're going to use to minimize your total costs. And now let's look at your constraints. Well, first is that your inventory should be, let's go ahead and do that first before we forget about it. Ending inventory should be 500. And then your ending stock out, you can't end this thing with this, and so you basically put that as a 0. Now let's go here. We are going to start this. Your workforce here, this is going to be equal to 0, and we know that because we have the heading there. Your inventory here is equal to your demand, and you know that because you've told yourself this is what you need to do. Now both these two, production and overtime, are greater than or equal to 0, so you can select both of them and say they are greater than or equal to 0. Okay, now you want to go here to engine, and here assume non-negative. You put that as true. You want to keep this as true, and the reason is you can't have negative values here. You can't have negative number of people, right? So you're going to essentially say it's equivalent to saying this is greater than or equal to 0. So you always are going to do that. And you also want to have one more constraint, which is these values here. You're going to go click and say they are integer values. All right. Once you have done that, you can click run, and you will get your answer. So this is, it says solver has found a solution, all constraints and optimality conditions are satisfied, which means you did this correctly. So let's take a look. Your minimum cost is 422,000. Your average seasonal inventory, you're going to have about 915 units on average, and it takes about 0.34 months for a unit to cycle through your inventory. Let's look at your plan. You're going to produce, there's going to be a flat production. You're going to have some stock out. There is inventory here. Here is your inventory each time period. You're going to lay off 15 workers, and then it's going to go down to 64. It is probably a good idea at this point of time to start looking at preparing graphs. So the first graph is to do with the inventory, stock out, production, and demand. So let's go here and create a chart, and we can do a scattered chart with these lines. Here we go, and you can see here it's a nice clean chart where we look at inventory, stock out, subcontracting, production is flat, demand goes up, then comes down, and we are handling this increase in demand over production by we're going to go ahead and use our inventory, and then we kind of go down on inventory and then go up again, and there is a little bit of stock out in period 4. This is your production plan. This is actually your production plan that you can show people what you're going to do, right? And When you do your production plan, make sure that you show them numbers saying, hey, here we're going to produce at 2600. You got to show people the numbers. You just can't show a pretty graph and leave it and let it go like that. So you got to show them numbers. So you have finished your production plan, but you also have to show people about your workforce plan. So let's go ahead and create a chart here. I'm going to start off by showing it as essentially a line chart, but let's go ahead and change the chart type, right? And go to combo. And let's change the hired to a clustered column, laid off to a clustered column, and workforce as a line, right? And I tend to like to change this to red, and if we had hired, I would change that to green, because hiring is nice and laying off is not so nice, right? So here we go. This is your workforce plan. Again, try to have numbers. Numbers are good. So here we have our production plan, you have your workforce plan, and this in total is your aggregate plan. And in this particular plan, you show them your total cost, your seasonal inventory, and average flow time. With this, we have finished the first part of an aggregate plan. The second part, which we'll do in a separate video, is what are the different things, different modifications? What if I said, hey, you can't have any subcontracting? What if I said you cannot have any back orders, or we need to reduce our seasonal inventory? What are the different conditions and how do we handle that? We'll talk about that in a separate video.